Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are getting into James Tynion's Batman run. And at the end of the video, we're going to talk about Punchline. A lot of you guys have been asking about her. We don't really have any information on her, right? But a lot of you guys have been asking, so I figured I would title this, Punchline, the Joker's new girlfriend. But she's had some scant appearances. And from what I understand, she's not really going to be a major player in Batman comics until we get to the Joker War. But you guys have been asking about her. You've been asking me to dump some information on her. So at the end of the video, I'll give you guys what we have. In any event, here's the thing about James Tynion's run, right? And this is one of the things to kind of be weary of when it comes to stories, right? James Tynion's Batman run is amazing so far, but so is Tom King's. And the issue is that by the time you got to the end of Tom King's run, it really kind of just seemed to be an exercise in self-indulgence with a great big huge story that really just didn't go anywhere. It's possible Tynion's run could go in that direction. We don't really know yet. But the cool thing about this is that Tynion is writing Batman the way he's been writing Detective Comics, which is awesome because his run on Detective Comics is amazing. Like it's ridiculously good. I feel like it's one of the unsung heroes of like DC right now, right? Like it's a super good story. But what this does is it initially picks up seemingly with a kind of coming together of various villains, right? But the first person we really pick up here with is a character by the name of Cheshire. Now Cheshire is a long-standing enemy of the Teen Titans. The funny thing about Cheshire is she's unique and really in comparison to a lot of the different like mercenaries and villains who are out there, right? Because when you look at the people who are here, you have like Mr. Teeth, which we'll talk about him here in a little bit. You've got Malcolm Merlyn, kind of the antithesis of Green Arrow in the Green Arrow comics. You've got Gunsmith, who's actually a pretty cool character in and of himself. And then of course you have a fifth person here. We'll find out who they are here in a second. But Cheshire, among all the various contract killers out there, is unique because of the fact that basically her hair, her fingernails, things like that, are all tainted with different poisons, right? So like at any point in time, she could scratch you and you could die from like the venom of an asp snake, or in this instance where she killed the doorman, the venom of what was basically a box jellyfish. Like these things are cool, right? It's one of the things that makes her really intriguing and really interesting, but it makes her difficult to capture, right? Because she's like a tree frog, right? Like an Amazonian tree frog. The entirety of her body is basically a giant poison. And so if you were to touch her, you were to grab her hair, or you were to be scratched by her nails, or bit by her, or something like that, or even possibly touch her skin, you could die. And so it's interesting. Like she's really intriguing in that way. But what this also does is it kind of switches over to Catwoman. Now, here's one of the cool things here, right, with Selina Kyle. This is one of the things that I love about what Tynion's doing that Tom King did differently. Whenever Tom King had like Batman and Catwoman talking, it just didn't sound natural, right? It was like watching an Alan Sorkin show, right? So like The Newsroom or like The West Wing, where people have conversations, but no one really talks like that in real life. And it kind of removed you from the comic, right? Like nobody talks that way, like when they would communicate and things like that. Tynion does a really, really good job of having discussions between characters, and it really just kind of feels organic, the way that Selina Kyle and Batwoman talk. It's not the most important thing out there, but it is kind of a cool thing. The other part of this that you really end up learning here is that Bruce Wayne is kind of going, or at least Batman's going headlong into the notion of like developing Gotham City, right? He's going into the notion of like developing Gotham and just making it a better place, as opposed to I'm running around as Batman and I'm beating up criminals in the middle of the night like I'm some kind of a schizophrenic, and that's my shtick, that's my thing, right? Like he's actually working to improve Gotham more so than he ever did before. And in fact, Tynion will kind of address this unlike years past. But the cool thing is that what he ends up doing is really kind of having this conversation with Lucius Fox, right? Where Batman is in the midst of developing this, not really a Batmobile, but not really a Batwing, kind of a blend between the two to a degree, which is somewhat of an interesting idea. But the big takeaway from this is he basically says that about 5 days prior on the dark web, that the Batcomputer picked up a message that was sent out and then deleted 3 minutes later. And what this basically did was kind of send out a message to 5 of the most capable assassins out there in the world, and basically said, meet in Gotham City on this day and we're going to complete a mission. And that basically Deathstroke is the one who's leading them. And this is an interesting thing here because Batman really sort of analyzes all the villains who were there, and it's just kind of like, okay, each one of these guys are interesting, Mr. Teeth and Gunsmith and Cheshire and so on. But the only person that I'm really worried about here is Deathstroke, because for Deathstroke, it's about the money, but also about the principle. If somebody's going to hire him for a job, it has to be worth doing, right? Because Deathstroke has enough money. So it's one of these things where he doesn't really need the cash. Is it worth my while to even take this job job in the first place, which he can kind of command, right? He's like the premier assassin in DC Comics. So like if you really want somebody to die, Deathstroke's the guy you get a hold of. So it's kind of interesting. And so because of this, Batman's essentially planned for a lot of these villains to take them down, but also realizes that Deathstroke's mind operating as fast as it does, and in fact, this kind of established here 9 times faster than the average man, means that Batman has to act and then respond in really an exceedingly short amount of time. Otherwise, Deathstroke will mentally get the upper hand. And this is an important thing because what it shows here is that while Bruce Wayne doesn't really consider Deathstroke to be an equal, he does consider Deathstroke to be somebody worth worrying about. And Deathstroke is in a lot of ways an equal to Batman, not, strictly in terms of fighting, but in terms of his ingenuity, how his mind works, his ability to comprehend and understand situations, to get in and out of different scenarios as fast as possible. I mean, for God's sake, the guy was facing off against Superman and just threw like glowing green rocks at him and tricked Superman into thinking it was kryptonite, right? So like small little things like that are what really make Deathstroke unique and intriguing here. And so of course, Batman executes this plan and basically, throws out what are called the Bat Shadow Casters. And what these are designed to do is basically kind of emit a shadow that more or less follows these various villains around and then tricks them into believing they're leading Batman into a trap, right? Where they can somehow take him out, when in reality, he's not there. Now, of course, going toe-to-toe against Deathstroke is a cool thing to see. With Deathstroke being there, him and Batman facing off against each other, it's largely been established multiple times over DC Comics that sometimes the battle can actually go either way. That sometimes Deathstroke can win because of his super soldier enhancements. Sometimes Batman can win because Batman's just the best fighter in DC Comics. But regardless, basically what Deathstroke says here is, like, you fighting me, this is the distraction. This is part of the big plan, right? Like, this is all going the way it's supposed to. And Batman's response is, I know exactly what's going on. Like, I know what it is that you're trying to do. And that's what we basically pick up with Catwoman, who followed a guy down into this kind of sub-basement with all this information, where the plans of Bruce Wayne in fixing Gotham City and kind of what it is that he wants to do with the city as a whole are intending to be replaced with a new set of designs by a person called The Designer. And the cool thing about this is that when this happens, when this goes down and Catwoman confronts this guy, ultimately he's just kind of like, you have to stop this guy. Like, I don't care what you have to do, but you have to stop this guy's plans from coming to fruition, after which this guy immediately begins to die, kind of breaking down and so on. But a disembodied voice seemingly starts to kind of come out of this guy's body and basically saying, like, Catwoman, I see you, I know you're here. You have to understand this plan that was concocted some time ago that you were a part of, it's now coming to fruition, right? The Designer is coming for Gotham City. Like, Catwoman immediately picks up on what's going on. And so what this does is it hits back to this idea that somewhere along the line, in part of the history of Gotham City, which we haven't really known about before, that Catwoman seemingly made a deal or made some kind of a bargain with this Designer guy, but we don't really know how far this goes, right? Just kind of hitting at this idea that there's some pretty clandestine stuff going on. But the cool thing about this is that this rabbit hole goes down pretty far, and we'll find out how far it goes. But what this does is it jumps to Batman, who basically jumps on his communicator and says, Alfred, send a priority signal to the Gotham City Police Department. And this is cool because my initial thought was, oh my God, Gotham's back. But it's interesting to see Tynion kind of picking up on what it is that Tom King did and continuing that continuity, because Alfred's dead. And that's where Lucius chimes in and says, Alfred isn't here anymore, man. Like, Alfred's gone, Batman. And Batman slipped, right? He knew that Alfred was gone, but it was just one of these things where he's so used to doing it. It's crushing for him to have to admit that Alfred's not here. And he actually just kind of, seems to cry. I mean, some of it seems like rain, but I would say Batman kind of seems to cry in response to this. And so as a result, he basically tells Lucius, grab that ship thing, we'll grab the villains and we'll take them off, and that'll basically be the end of that. And so what you basically end up doing is you end up jumping to Riddler, who's having a conversation with the Penguin. Of course, the Penguin killing various people who were there. And this is when things get cool, because what the Riddler says is, I've been watching everything that's been going on with Gotham City. I've been watching all these things take place, so on and so forth. And like the Designer is coming to town, right? The Designer is here in Gotham City. The response of Penguin is, yeah, I know. And I've taken out anybody who knows what it is that I've been doing, right? Who knows about my plans or anything like that. Literally, all the villains are basically cleaning house. Whoever this Designer is, whoever this guy is here, whatever it is he's capable of and whatever he's about, is scaring the hell out of the villains, right? It's scaring them enough to where Penguin is killing off his henchmen, so there's no one there to drop any information, and the Riddler's scared out of his wits, right? The Riddler's just like, dude, this guy is no joke. And so it's kind of crazy because, we've seen things with like Bane taking over Gotham City, so on and so forth. The difference between this, the way this is going down and what Tom King did is that in this story, you feel the stakes. You're like, okay, so like something's getting ready to pop off in Gotham. Something really bad is getting ready to happen. But that's the thing is the Riddler's response is like, the Designer is coming to collect. The Designer is coming for all of us as the villains. And Penguin's response is, he can try. And so this is when when things get interesting, because from there, you pick up with the various villains, of course, who have essentially been apprehended by Batman. And what you learn is you have this place called the Bloc. And the Bloc is basically this prison that's designed to hold people that are escape dangers. Now, the reason why this is awesome, and this is an amazing invention by James Tynion, because I'm pretty sure he's the one who made it. When you look at the Batman mythos and you look at like Arkham Asylum, Arkham is for the most part a revolving door, right? Like Two-Face or Penguin or Joker or any number of those guys, Riddler, Mad Hatter, whoever, you know, the Mr. Freeze, they're busted by Batman, and then it's only a matter of time before they escape from Arkham. In order to avoid this, what Batman had done, working alongside Lucius Fox and really even the Gotham City Police Department, was create the Bloc as a place where escaping criminals, right? So like Bane and Joker, people like that who present a clear and present danger to Gotham City itself, could be held and detained. But you basically got 10 feet of cement, which is lined with concrete. The idea is that like no one can get out of here, right? Like once you're in, you're in. And there's only two ways in and out of this whole Bloc. The first one is basically a DNA encoded set of keys that are only used by Gotham City Police Department. And the second one is an interest that only Batman knows about. And so when Batman gets in there and starts talking to Deathstroke is immediately like, hey man, like, you know, I'm not going to tell you who it was that hired me, so don't waste your time. The other people don't know, so they can't tell you. But here's the thing. One, I'm going to break out of here, right? Like, I'm not going to be in here forever. This is a cool little game you're playing, and I like that you believe you can hold me. It's cute, but understand, I'm Deathstroke, right? Like, I will get out of this place. And then two, this is a game that you're playing. It's interesting to watch you play this game because you're going to lose, and it's going to be fun to watch you fail. But this is a game that you will not win. So wish me luck when I get out of here. And that's when Batman basically tells Bloc, who's basically operating as a commissioner, presumably because of the events of the Batman Who Laughs and the fact that Commissioner Gordon is basically there with the Batman Who Laughs as part of his, you know, evil group or whatever, his evil Justice League. Who cares? Nobody's reading that anymore. The thing is that, like, when he basically has the cell of Cheshire opened up, Batman rubs her face and then realizes that it's clay, that it's a body double, right? Like, it's not actually Cheshire herself. And so immediately goes on the defensive with Lucius, says, find Cheshire, track her down. They successfully do. They end up locating her. And then one of the most crazy things to come out of this, in this Batwing, you know, ship thing that Bruce Wayne has, he shoots himself out of the railgun. He literally shoots himself out of the railgun in order to track her down as fast as possible, because of the fact that the buildings she's traveling between are too narrow for him to just like swoop down and pick her up with like some kind of a chain and then do like he did in Detective Comics number 27, where he just hangs her and it's just like, she's better off this way. But nonetheless, you know, jumping out of here, or at least when Cheshire makes her move to try to take out Bruce Wayne, and then immediately goes to basically dig her nails into his skin, that the intention is that he's going to end up dying from whatever poison he's exposed to. Now, of course, this leads to basically Cheshire being hit by a truck while Batman slides underneath it. And while it's not enough to kill her, it is enough to incapacitate her. And then, of course, Batman reveals that he basically had a kind of membrane in his suit that essentially absorbed the poison. So, you know, Batman's plot armor strikes again. But then at that moment, suddenly Deathstroke and all of his guys escape from the facility. And that's when we basically end up finding out here that what was going on is that Penguin basically made his move, right? Penguin had jumped in here, and Penguin was the one who freed all of these guys. He's the one that got them all out of there, which is kind of a cool thing to see. And so then what you do is you basically jump to the Riddler having a conversation with Catwoman. The Catwoman's basically made her way to a cemetery after that, you know, conversation with the one guy who she believed to have been dead, ends up having a conversation with her and basically saying, hey, I haven't used this line for quite some time, but you have to understand, we all made a deal with the designer. We made a deal with him, and he's coming to collect. So you, me, anybody who was involved with that, we're all either going to die or we're going to have to play ball. The indication is that the designer is going to kill them all, right? That's the indication. He's going to kill all the villains of Batman. That's why this is so cool, right? Because the stakes feel so intense, right? It's just like, dude, all the villains of Batman are going to die. And it sucks, especially for Catwoman, because she's a good guy now. And it's one of the things that's really kind of communicated here when it comes to Riddler, is he says, the whole reason why we got together with the designer was to commit, quote unquote, the perfect crime. But basically, you know, house is being cleaned by all of us. Me as the Riddler, I never really had henchmen, so I don't really have to worry about that. I'm basically gonna, like, I'm getting out of here, like I'm jumping ship. The Penguin cleaned house on his end. We have to assume that if there are any other villains that are involved, they've done the exact same thing as well. But the belief of Catwoman is that the Joker's somehow involved here. And so, of course, traveling to the cemetery, this is done for the intention of finding the casket of the Joker, which she does. He's basically laying down inside this casket. Now, for those of you guys who are unsure, or who are kind of looking at this, like, when did the Joker die? This basically appeared to have happened back in Batman issue number 49 by Tom King as part of the lead up to the wedding that never happened between Batman and Catwoman. Catwoman. And there was kind of like this Killing Joke moment, right? Where Catwoman and Joker got into a fight, and then she slashed his throat with her claws. And then they had this great big huge long, conversation basically, which Tom King did with unnecessarily with a lot of situations. But basically at the end of it, Joker seemingly died, right? He's just kind of seemed to have been dead ever since. Now, continuity wise, I don't know how that fits into Doomsday Clock. I don't think DC knows. I don't think they really care enough to figure it all out. But the long and short of it is that at the moment right now, all indications are that the Joker's dead, right? So the question becomes, if the Joker's dead, then how is his disembodied voice communicating with anybody who's out there, right? Or seemingly communicating with her, at least as Catwoman believed. And so the other part of this is, of course, Batman essentially apprehending Cheshire is then contacted by Lucius Fox, who gives him one of the coolest inventions ever. What he basically says is that inside of your utility belt is a device called the Echo. And what the Echo does is it basically allows you to attach it to any vehicle that's out there, which in turn will hack into the Wayne Enterprises components within the car, and then basically allow the car's appearance to change. It creates a kind of hologram, but it'll make any car look like a Batmobile, and then it'll allow it to drive as fast as the Batmobile, which is cool, because basically what this means is that Batman's got a Batmobile in his pocket, right? Like at any point in time, he can just slap this thing onto a car and then drive off. Now, Batman's response is like, you want me to jack a car and then turn it into a Batmobile and then drive? And Lucius is like, well, it's my car, so you're fine. But nonetheless, the funny thing is that, kind of switching back to Catwoman, in the midst of this whole thing where she kind of comes to frustration with the fact that, one, the Riddler basically says, I'm cutting this line now, I'm leaving. There'll be no more communication between you and me. Good luck with the designer. Hopefully you get out in time, but understand that you're probably going to have to break this news to Batman, something that, it's this kind of ultimate betrayal, more or less, that you committed against him without him really knowing. She's also met with the arrival of these two kind of henchmen of sorts, who basically show up and then essentially, almost kind of knock her out or knock her unconscious, and then start burying her there along with the Joker, and so of course, picking up with the Penguin, the Penguin basically there with Deathstroke and all those guys is kind of like, look, like, here's the deal. I'm skipping town, right? Like, I'm getting out of here. I don't want to have anything to do with the designer. I know the designer was the one that hired you guys. I will pay you double your rate if you guys leave Gotham, and then you guys sign a non-compete clause. Basically, you won't return to Gotham within a calendar year. And the response to Deathstroke is, you couldn't afford my price, right? So you can't even afford double my price. And then in turn, intends to go and kill the Penguin, only for Batman to basically show up. And then of course, he's kind of told, hey man, just so you know, like, attaching the Echo to any car does not give you the kind of armor that the Batmobile has. So just keep that in mind, man. It's just a hologram, right? So if they shoot you, you're probably gonna die if you get shot in like the jaw or something like that, somewhere where your armor doesn't protect you. But for the most part, the various henchmen who are here are overtaken like that, right? I mean, they're for the most part taken out quick, fast, and in a hurry by Batman, at which point the, Deathstroke responds, stop. Like, if you keep fighting, I'm gonna kill the Penguin. And so it's cool because Malcolm Merlyn grabs Cheshire, the villains make their escape, and Deathstroke slices the throat of the Penguin. And it's, dude, like, when this happened, I was like, holy cow, dude, like, dude, is the Penguin gonna die? The classic villains of Batman are basically being killed off, so of course this leads to Deathstroke making the smart move. It's the smartest move for him to make, right? Knowing Batman as he knows him, he knows that Batman will not let the Penguin die, right? Batman, despite all the glitz and glamour and all the stuff that he does, is a champion of life, right? So he's not going to let the Penguin die. And so Deathstroke knows this, and he essentially says, you have one of two choices. Either you can come after us and you can let the Penguin die, or you can save Penguin. But we know you're not going to let him die. We know how this game's going to play out. We'll see you when we see you. We're going to go after our targets. And basically they end up leaving while Batman goes to save Penguin himself. And so with that going down, the Penguin in turn spills the beans and basically says, years ago, right? You never knew about this. Nobody ever told you, but years ago, myself, Joker, Catwoman, like Riddler, the underworld essentially united to commit the perfect crime. And the perfect crime was to take out Bruce Wayne, right? To ally ourselves with the designer, and the designer's goal was to take out Bruce Wayne. That these guys here, right? These, Deathstroke and all those guys, they're there to take out false targets. The way this looks like it was supposed to go down is that Batman was not supposed to know what was actually going on, that instead you'd have these criminals who showed up here, they would take out false targets, Batman would chase around, try to figure out what's going on, and the designer instead would basically take out the plans of Bruce Wayne to destroy what it is that he wanted to do with Gotham City itself. The other indication here is that if the designer is looking to take out Bruce Wayne, that would seem arbitrary, right? Like, I mean, he's just a really rich guy as far as the world's concerned. All anybody, aside from the Justice League and the individuals who know that Bruce Wayne is Batman. Bruce Wayne is just a really rich guy who's trying to make Gotham better, seemingly. The indication here is the designer knows that Bruce Wayne is Batman. Like that kind of seems to be what the case is. Now, there, it's cool to see that, because then you switch over, of course, to Catwoman, and Catwoman basically kind of digs herself out. She's like, I'm not gonna die here. Like, I'm not gonna die buried alive in a grave with the Joker's corpse. Like, that's ridiculous. She kind of ends up jumping out, and then, of course, is saved by none other than Harley Quinn, which is kind of crazy, because it's like, why in the heck is Harley Quinn even here? Which is kind of nuts. Now, of course, from there, the Penguin is basically dropped off at like a Gotham City hospital by Batman. Literally, Batman grabbed the Penguin, drove to this location out of the vehicle, left him on the steps of the hospital, and was like, I got stuff to do, and then left. Which is kind of screwed up. But Batman ends up going after these false targets, right? Now, this is important, because what this shows is Batman is trying to do it all, right? Now, the reality is Batman wouldn't let the false targets die, right? That was the whole message of the Penguin. Gunsmith and Mr. Teeth and Cheshire and Deathstroke, so on. They're gonna go after the false targets and they're gonna kill them, right? So innocent people are basically going to die if Batman chose not to go after these guys. And that's kind of the danger of all this, right? Like, the designer really seems to be orchestrating things in such a way to where Batman's being pushed to his limits. And in a lot of ways he is, because this comes hot off the heels of everything that just happened with City of Bane, the death of Alfred, and all that kind of stuff, right? And so kind of going after the gunsmith, we sort of get a rundown on this guy. This guy's name is Douglas Worth. And basically he was a veteran, of half a dozen military contractors, as is explained by James Tynion, and then ultimately was fired from each and every one for using experimental weapons in the field without any kind of approval whatsoever. But the reason why he got his name is that basically he kind of fashioned a silencer out of different things that he found from an electronics store, and then killed a guy on a plane that was full of people, and no one knew that he did it, right? So he was just that capable. But the issue is that at the end of the day, despite his capabilities with fashioning weapons seemingly out of just arbitrary components, kind of being like this MacGyver sort of situation, he's no match for Batman, right? So he's taken out with a quickness, right? I mean, that happens quick, fast, and in a hurry. Following that is Mr. Teeth, and Mr. Teeth sort of gained his name because of the fact that what he was doing was going through and killing people, and then surgically removing the teeth from their mouth and then surgically putting them inside their stomachs, right? Now, why he was doing that, we don't know. Probably because he's just crazy as hell. But of course, he's taken out by Batman as well with a quickness, right? The other thing behind this is that they're currently, he's currently in the lair of the Riddler. And so the indication seems to be here that these 5 guys were basically tasked with tracking down the classic villains of Batman: Catwoman, the Riddler, Penguin, presumably Two-Face, the Joker, these major members of the criminal underworld. They're each going to take out one of them. And of course, Mr. Teeth was here to take out the Riddler. And so with Mr. Teeth being removed from the equation, this in turn allows Batman to basically analyze the only real footage left there by Riddler by Edward Nygma, which was done, of course, intentionally for Batman to follow up on. And it's cool to see that James Tynion does this, right? It's cool to see him look at this and say, okay, let's still maintain this role of the Riddler. What Edward Nygma was doing is that when he was confronted by the designer, he was making a series of hand gestures. And these hand gestures were essentially, a riddle, more or less. On a keyboard of sorts, they were more or less a riddle. And Batman understanding and deciphering this, picking up this riddle is basically the question: what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in midday, and 3 legs in the evening? And the response to Lucian Fox is, well, man, I have no idea how that makes sense. But of course, Batman figuring it out basically says, okay, this essentially grants them access to the computer systems, which basically shows them that the Riddler was running a track that nobody else was, right? That Batman wasn't or anybody else wasn't, which was on Deathstroke. And so that, of course, gives them the location of Deathstroke, which Batman, sends out his little bat drones in order to track him down. But what this does is that from here, it switches directly over to Batman and to Catwoman, Catwoman and Harley Quinn showing up. And then Catwoman basically saying, like, we need to talk, like, we need to have a conversation. I need to tell you about all of these things. That it's a guy called the Designer, that he's basically here. Now, Batman, for the most part, knows what the Penguin told him, but he doesn't really know everything. And so it's at this point when Catwoman apologizes that we get into essentially the new girlfriend of the Joker. A lot of you guys have been asking about this. A lot of you guys have been asking me questions. What's going on with the girlfriend of the Joker? This is all we have, right? This is it. It's basically just a girl who calls the Joker and is just like, hey, they've seen the grave, but their attention's been drawn elsewhere. And the Joker's response is, okay, like, I have something else to attend to, right? Like, I have other people to talk to before this goes down. This is it, guys. Like, this is all we have stuff with the girlfriend of the Joker. I don't really understand why people are freaking out over it. I mean, I get it insofar as it's the Joker's new girlfriend, but aside from this and like an appearance in Hell Arisen, there's nothing else here, right? Like, she's not going to be a major player until April or May when it comes to Joker War. All we're going to get is these little teaser one-page moments, and that's basically going to be it, right? So this is kind of strange to me, you know, in terms of people getting super hyped up and everybody asking me about it, right? It's like people who are asking me to explain the One Below All on Marvel Comics. We don't know enough. We can't explain it because we don't know enough, and we don't really know anything about her. All we know is that she's just a character who's there, and that's basically it. But the big takeaway from all this is the Joker is alive, right? The Joker's very much alive. We don't really know how, but the Joker is very much alive. Maybe he's one of the 3 mysterious Jokers, and that's essentially it. And then you end up picking up with Harley Quinn, who's basically controlling a bunch of these weapons belonging to Batman and is sending them after Deathstroke, right? So this part of the story kind of kicks off, you know, it picks up with a bang. And it's kind of a cool thing because what it does is it switches back over to Catwoman and to Bruce Wayne. Now, one of the things that James Tynion kept going after the events of Tom King was the relationship between Catwoman and Bruce Wayne. And a lot of people really liked this, right? It just kind of made sense. One of the things that always kind of threw me off about Tom King's writing was the way that Batman and Catwoman talked to each other. Just never really seemed organic. James Tynion really seems to correct that, right? Tom King's writing was a little weird, but James Tynion really seems to correct that and basically giving us this seemingly organic conversation between the two. But because of the fact that Catwoman was one of the initial individuals who dealt with the designer, she's the one that basically has all this information. And the response of Batman is, I need you to tell me everything that's going on. And so what this does is it gives us a kind of flashback with the origin of the designer himself, insofar as it's given to us here. And what we basically learn is that at some point in the past, seemingly around 20 years ago, you know, seems to be the indication that Catwoman was basically just a kind of burglar, right? She was in the early days of her career, but there was a kind of legend of a guy named the Designer, this individual out there that was responsible for pulling off some of the greatest heists that ever happened. It's cool here because he was almost kind of like this mythical, enigmatic figure, right? He existed, but it's one of these things where people were just kind of like, this guy's more myth than actual fact. And so what ended up happening is that there was basically a card sent to Catwoman that was essentially an invitation from the Designer to meet at a particular location. When she arrives there, she's met by the Riddler, she's met by Joker, and she's met by Penguin, all of whom have been invited as well. And they're seemingly brought in by this guy on a boat, which is kind of creepy in terms of how he looks. It's almost like crossing the river Styx, right? Where like you have to pay the coins to the guy on the boat. I don't remember what his name is. He has an actual name in Greek and Roman theology, but nonetheless, they're basically brought to this house, right? It's called the House of Tartarus, where they meet with the Designer for the very first time. And it's kind of nuts here because the Designer sort of pops up and really says, like, when he's talking to the Joker, he's like, you're the clown prince of crime, like your reputation precedes you. The indication here is that the Designer knows everything about these guys. And then when they are brought here, their weapons are basically handed over to make sure that nothing pops off, but it's kind of a cool thing. The other cool thing about this is the Designer looks amazing, right? In terms of his design, he looks absolutely awesome. But it's kind of a cool thing because what we also end up learning is that with this guy here, with the Designer, in his past, he had basically come across a kind of detective. And there is more to the story, but we'll figure out, you know, what that is later on down the line. But this Designer had basically faced off against this detective and ultimately found what we basically see with Batman comics all the time, that the villain fights the good guy and the good guy always wins because the good guy's always 1 or 2 steps ahead. The Designer kind of found himself in this constant struggle of always losing because the detective he was fighting was just that much more intelligent than he was. And he came to the realization that in order to win, he has to outthink the detective. More so than that, it can't just be a plan the detective doesn't expect. He has to be so far ahead that by the time the detective realizes there's no chance for him to win, he's already lost. And ultimately, the Designer ended up spending a year inside of his own facility, right? His own kind of base of operations, for lack of a better word, and just kept coming up with all these ideas and all these plans that were so advanced and so nuanced, the detective never saw them coming. And the only real indication we get here is that the detective was not actually killed by the Designer. Instead, he was left essentially disgraced, right? He was left disgraced and for the most part, the world seems to have lost faith in him. And ultimately, he just ended up dying, seemingly of old age, but just ended up dying, you know, realizing that he was defeated by what seemed to be either his greatest foe or any one of the many foes that he faced off against. But the Designer proved to be successful in that regard. And so what it does is it basically allows the Designer to tell the various people, these various villains, this story, and then say, I can help all of you achieve your goal. Now, it's interesting the way that Tynion writes this because the villains really just kind of seem to go along with it, right? I mean, the reputation of the Designer really seems to kind of solidify that he's a guy that deserves to be believed, but there's no guarantee that his reputation is really accurate outside of the various rumors and hearsay that the villains have heard. And so we're just kind of left to assume that the Designer is actually correct, right? He can do this stuff because his reputation is such that the individuals who are telling the story are beyond contestation as far as these various villains are concerned. But it is a pretty cool concept here. And so with Catwoman and with the Riddler and with Penguin meeting with the designer in turn, they all kind of come out really a lot happier than they were going in, because there seems to be truth to the idea that the designer can help them achieve their goals. Now, the whole reason behind this is the designer can get rich, right? He's like, I'm going to help all of you achieve your goals, but I want half of all your earnings, right? I want half of everything you take, and then we'll just, you'll never hear from me again. And so finally, the designer meets with the Joker. And as we know, the Joker is really kind of a wild card. You never really know what's going to happen. And so somehow we don't really know what was said, but the result was that when the Joker had his conversation with the designer immediately comes out and it's just like, kill them all. So whatever the Joker said pissed this guy off nice and good. Not only that, with everything popping off, right? Like all these forces of the designer coming after all the various villains who were here, the Joker ends up revealing that he still has a gun that he kept hidden, and he shoots the designer in the head, and that seems to be the end of him. Not only that, the various henchmen of the designer are taken out. The Joker seemingly killed everybody here. It is kind of nuts, because it's like, what in the world could the Joker have possibly said to this guy that would have led to this becoming what it was? Not only that, you also end up having the villains here saying, okay, then we're going to sweep this under the rug. This is going to be our dirty little secret. And that's kind of the secret they were referencing in the video that we did last time, right? They all kind of share this mutual secret. We didn't really know how deep it went, but basically the designer was the guy who was going to help them achieve their goals. None of their goals could be achieved without the funding of the designer, which really seemed to be kind of the plan, right? Like, I'll tell you how you can achieve your goal, but it's all for naught if you don't have the financial backing to do it, right? The money to be able to pull it off. And so they have these plans with no means to achieve them. And so they end up kind of sweeping the whole thing under the rug. But for the Joker himself, where they burn Tartarus house and just kind of leave it there, the Joker is kind of staring off at the distance. And that's when Catwoman comments that she began to realize how evil the Joker is going to become, because the Joker basically knows what his plan is. He knows what he can do. And the Joker could essentially find a way to bypass the finances needed by the designer and then in turn pull it off on his own anyway. Not only that, when Catwoman finishes this conversation with Batman, Batman comes to the realization that the plan of Catwoman was to basically rob him. Her plan was to rob Bruce Wayne. And so if the designer could help her achieve that goal, then the designer knew that Batman is Bruce Wayne. Not only that, the designer knows how to access his family's wealth, meaning Batman could seemingly lose everything. And so what it does is it switches over to the Joker, basically in the modern day, talking to a bartender, essentially drinking what looks like a margarita. But he kind of starts telling the story from his perspective and basically says that during this meeting they had with the designer, that the designer basically said, I can help you guys achieve these various goals, right? And so ultimately he said, like, each of you guys will get a boon, you'll basically get some kind of financial backing, so on and so forth. And so ultimately the Penguin wanted to be king of Gotham City, right? He wanted to be the mayor. He wanted to be the one to run the show. The Riddler wanted to be the smartest person in Gotham City, and Catwoman wanted to be the wealthiest. But with Joker sitting down and looking at this and realizing that there would be no room for the designer in Gotham City itself, the Joker came to the realization that what the designer intended to do was help them achieve their goals, and then with nobody else there, take them all out, and then seemingly be the only one to conquer Gotham City. Or the indication is that Joker was the one who wanted to do that. But basically what he told the designer is, if you're the devil, then I want to take your place. I want to kill you, and I want to be the one to conquer Gotham City. And that seems to have been the reason why the designer kind of freaked out, because the Joker was the one that seemed to pick up on what it was that was actually happening. Again, this is Joker, and the way he tells his stories are oftentimes ambiguous in the sense that we don't know if they're ever true. We don't know if he's ever really telling the truth. But again, what it does is it basically picks up with Deathstroke and Batman on, Batman hot on his trail. The fact that Harley Quinn is basically kind of blowing through all the various devices of Batman, and Batman ends up chiming into Lucius Fox and saying, like, shut down her control of these things. She's basically spending money like water through a sieve. That's not okay. That's the problem. Bruce Wayne ultimately manages to track down Deathstroke, and of course he ends up taking him captive, or at least, Deathstroke jumps onto the Batwing and then just starts like attacking it and so on and so forth. One thing that does happen here is Catwoman ends up locating Harley Quinn, and then the two of them basically leave for track down the designer or something along those lines. They're met by a couple of Jokerized members from the Gotham City Police Department. This kind of seems to be partially a scheme of the Joker. We're not entirely sure here, but what it does is it allows a kind of battle between Batman and Deathstroke. Now, the reality is that this has kind of been done to death, right? Batman versus Deathstroke. But what makes this interesting is the conversation between the two, because what you end up having here is Deathstroke and Batman really having this conversation where Batman kind of looks around and says, like, down there in Gotham City, there's 9 million people. And ironically enough, their faith in their government actually went up when Bane took control. It's one of these interesting things. We talked about that in the City of Bane story arc. Like, people would say, God, it's terrible that Bane took over Gotham and all that kind of stuff. But at the end, according to the people there, he made the city a better place. That Batman's not really willing to do what it takes in order to actually win this battle. That's the interesting thing about the Batman mythos, is I hear people kind of create these arguments all the time of like, well, if that were the logic, then like Superman should kill his villains and Spider-Man should kill his villains and so on and so forth. But Batman categorically and unequivocally has the worst, most violent rogues gallery in all of comic books. And that's why there's a legitimate case to make there in saying that Batman should kill all his villains, right? Because the city of Gotham would be better off with all those various villains dead. It's cool because Batman kind of looks at this and says, yeah, like this city is the way it is because of me. And it's one of these things where he almost kind of tries to play it based on like, well, you know, I mean, my parents died when I was a little kid. They were shot in an alley and I had to go down this path and all this kind of stuff. And Deathstroke's not buying it. He's like, at the end of the day, man, you can come to me with whatever story you want to, but you escalated. We were criminals doing criminal things. You're the one who donned a cloak and cowl, and then you're the one that started taking us out the way that you did. We had to step up because you stepped up. You're sort of left asking the question, right? If Bruce Wayne becoming Batman is what led to criminals becoming more violent, then is Batman really the reason why Gotham is the way it is? Were criminals ever going to become that violent in the first place, or did they only ever really get that way because of Batman? It's interesting to look at it for the other, from the other side of the equation. And so Batman tries to reason with Deathstroke and it's like, look, I'm trying to change the fact that I've gotten extreme in recent years, because he has. Batman's become more and more extreme as comics have gone on. You look at like Silver Age Batman, and then you compare him to like Batman from like Infinite Crisis, Final Crisis, the New 52. Batman's gotten more and more extreme over the years, because remember, it's all just one cohesive continuity now, right? So Batman has gotten more extreme over the years, and where he's like, I'm trying to change this extreme nature, but what I need you guys to do is to basically slow down and stop. The response to Deathstroke is, no, that's not going to happen, right? Like, we're not going to slow down, we're not going to stop. And so Batman basically like just lunges at him and sends the both of them flying off the Batwing. And ultimately, Deathstroke calls his bluff, right? He's like, look, man, you can do this all day long if you want to, but we both know you're going to shoot one of your bat grappling guns, right? So just do that, do the damn thing, and then save us, right? And that's exactly what he does, right? He shoots a grappling hook and basically ends up saving him and Deathstroke, and that's essentially it. And it's kind of a funny thing, because Deathstroke can essentially play Batman like a fiddle. Batman's predictable. There's just a line that Batman won't cross. And because the villains know Batman won't cross that line, at the end of the day, he's always only ever a half measure, because it's kind of like, I won't do what needs to be done in order to save Gotham City, because I don't believe in killing, right? My parents were killed and, you know, yada, 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 and so on and so forth. But sometimes it's in the best interest to kill a villain, right? It's in the interest of people. By Batman not killing his villains, all he's doing is sacrificing innocent lives, right? He's saying like the thousands of people that Joker's going to kill over the course of a year or several years or something like that, they are not as valuable as the Joker's life, right? The Joker being redeemed is more valuable than those innocent people. And that's why it's always an interesting question. How many lives is Batman willing to sacrifice before he says enough is enough? Because in the end, if he has the means to kill the Joker, but he doesn't, he is in effect sacrificing those people's lives. And so where the designer finally pops up to Batman and basically says, you know, Deathstroke, you're done now, indicating to Deathstroke that he's going to get screwed over on his contract, Batman's kind of like, you know, come and face me. And the response to the designer is, no, we still have one more game left. And that's when Edward Nygma, the Riddler, pops up and says, the entirety of Gotham City is now under my control. I've split the entire city into what's basically a giant crossword puzzle. And there's these enormous walls as tall as buildings, you know, and it's like, everybody stay put where you are. The only way the entire city is going to be let loose is if Batman's able to correctly solve this crossword puzzle. If he guesses wrong, then I basically blow up a bomb, right? And the indication here is that if he guesses like 3 across and like 4 down and he gets it wrong, that section gets destroyed with a bomb. And so lives are basically in jeopardy here. This is the kind of thing I'm talking about, right? Like, this wouldn't be a problem if Edward Nygma were dead. And so it's kind of interesting, because ultimately Lucius Fox cannot really locate where Edward Nygma is, where the Riddler is, and Nygma just starts cutting off Batman's communications in order to force him in a situation where he has to use his own wits in order to be able to pull this off. And it's kind of cool, because this is an insane amount of hubris on behalf of the Riddler, because where this kind of starts going down, Batman ends up, of course, taking Deathstroke, who's currently handcuffed, and then takes him to like a Batman train. Literally, Batman has a bat train. And so while that's happening, while Batman's facing off against these forces of the designer, who are seemingly kind of coming out of nowhere and waiting on this train to arrive, then you end up having Riddler, who's asking these questions, right? 1 across, 9 spaces. The more I take, the more I leave behind. Batman's response: footsteps. Joker comes in, 8 down, 5 spaces. What has many keys but can open no doors? Batman's response: piano. He's answering all these things like that, right? Just off the top of his head. And this is James Tynion really showing the intelligence of Bruce Wayne. This is one of the most important aspects, and it's one of the coolest things, right? Because like when you look at Snyder's Batman run, what really showcased Bruce Wayne's intelligence was the small things, right? Now, some of that was because it's Batman comics, Batman can't die, because, you know, he's just too popular for DC to kill off. He just sells too well, right? And so That's why Batman always comes out on top. But to see a display of his intelligence like this, just constantly countering Edward Nygma's questions, every time he asks a scenario, Batman basically answers almost perfectly, right? 10 across, 11 spaces. A woman shoots her husband, holds him underwater for 5 minutes, hangs him, and then takes him out to dinner. How was that possible? The response of Batman: photography. She took a picture of him, right? Being able to like counter every single one of Edward Nygma's riddles off the top of his head with the greatest of ease, despite being completely battle worn and totally exhausted, shows how far above Edward Nygma Batman really is. And that's where Nygma starts getting pissed off. And that was always his weakness, right? In comics, that was always the weakness of Edward Nygma. He would let his temper get the better of him if Batman started getting the better of him. It was just kind of it was always the thing that ended up catching him off guard. Now from here, this picks up with Catwoman and Harley Quinn in a pretty interesting scenario, right? We end up finding out what it is that Harley Quinn and Catwoman are actually up to. And in reality, it's just Catwoman. Harley Quinn's just kind of along for the ride. But we end up finding out that what Catwoman is looking for is someone called the Underbroker. And this is an individual who basically has access to essentially every bank account across the entirety of Gotham City. You can access anybody's account using the help of this particular guy. Now, Catwoman says that she has the account numbers, that she is a member of their club in good standing, and this basically leads to Catwoman being allowed in by the Underbroker himself. The issue with this is that as Catwoman gets in there, they're met by the arrival of Punchline. The Punchline is actually there. Not only that, this is when Harley Quinn meets the Joker's new girlfriend for the very first time, and it is cool because Harley Quinn doesn't initially know that. Instead, it's just kind of like Punchline's like, I'm here to make a withdrawal too. I'm the punchline. I'm where you end. It's kind of a lame phrase to have, but it is a cool thing to see them encounter each other, because when Harley Quinn's like, who in the world is this person? Catwoman's like, she's the Joker's new girlfriend. And Harley's like, oh, this girl's in for a time. You would think Harley Quinn would be pissed about being replaced, right? Like, oh, no. Let me tell you something. Harley Quinn is often imitated, never duplicated. That's not the response, right? That's not what happens. Instead, Harley's kind of like, okay, so like, you're in for a rough ride. Like, I know it seems cool to be the Joker's new girlfriend at the moment. He's gonna screw you up in ways that you can't even begin to imagine yet. Not only that, Harley's whole thing is like, are you funny? Because you don't really sound funny. And like, Punchline tries to make a few sort of veiled threats and outright threats and tries to make a few jokes here and there. But at the end of the day, Harley's not buying it. She's like, I've been around this block more than a few times. You got nothing. You got nothing, no jokes, no puns, no anything. You are a poor man's Harley Quinn. And then she basically tells her, like, in a few years and a few dozen cries in the shower and so on and so forth, I'm gonna buy you a frozen margarita and we're gonna have a girl-to-girl chat about how you made the worst decision of your life. But until then, I'm gonna bash your head in with a hammer. And immediately attacks the girl. I love that. Not only that, of course, Catwoman ends up getting her hand on the Underbroker, and then we end up finding out, who this guy is, right? That his name is Harlan Graves. This guy has all kinds of information, but Catwoman knows everything about him as well. And so it's like, if you don't tell me what I want to know, I'm going to start spewing all your private information for Harley Quinn and for Punchline to hear. And if you don't want me to do that, you're going to take me to a computer terminal to get me where I need to go. The reality and what seems to be going on here is that if the designer does have the plan of Catwoman, which was to rob Bruce Wayne, and seemingly has sent Punchline for that purpose to access that computer terminal, then of course Catwoman is there to basically withdraw those funds or to move those funds to a different location so the designer can't get his hands on it, right? So Bruce Wayne doesn't lose everything. And so with that being the case, Batman ends up tracking down the Riddler after he recognizes where it is the Riddler's at. He takes out the Riddler, right? It's not a great big huge thing. Riddler's not really physically capable in comparison to Batman. The Riddler's taken out pretty quickly. Batman basically knocks out Deathstroke with a tranquilizer dart. That's enough to keep an elephant asleep for a few hours. So on Deathstroke, it'll probably work for like half an hour, 45 minutes, because of his healing factor. And so Batman is basically kind of met by the arrival of the designer, who says, it's cool, you've unraveled all your adversaries' designs. That's awesome, but it's not going to be enough, because you must know that if I'm in Bruce Wayne's office, then it means I must know who you are. And the designer confirms that in saying, hello, Bruce Wayne, it's time that you and I have a conversation before I kill you. The fact that the designer's here now really kind of gives us a perspective into what's going on, because what you get here is Batman basically telling the designer, tell me how this goes, right? Give me this scenario. And the designer's response is no. Like, if you've already deduced it, then you tell me what happens. And so we kind of get this big explanation in terms of how it was all supposed to go down, right? So this is how the designer's plan was originally going to unfold in the city of Gotham before everything went belly up with the Joker and all those guys, right? So initially the idea was to bring in 5 of the highest paid assassins, the best paid assassins in the whole world, right? And at that point in time, back then, when this was all kind of brought together initially, right? Because the actual plan of the designer took place in the past. It would have been Deathstroke, Deadshot, Lady Shiva, KG Beast, and Merlin. Now, the whole idea behind them was to basically launch a simultaneous attack all at once in the city of Gotham, not against the entirety of the city's populace, but instead against those individuals who would basically be in the line of succession when it comes to the fall of the mayor, right? So you'd have the mayor who would be taken out, the deputy mayor, the public advocate, the city comptroller, and the majority leader of the city council, right? So they would all be taken out in one fell swoop, just all seemingly happening in almost an instant. This would lead to Batman basically jumping in and starting to investigate. But what it would also lead to is the Penguin basically becoming mayor of Gotham City. Now, as the mayor, this in turn would move to the Riddler, and the Riddler would lock down the entirety of the city of Gotham. But what he would do here is he would operate on two fronts. The first front would be a ruse. It would basically be, well, they're, riddle me this, and all the puzzles and all that kind of stuff. The truth about it was to basically isolate the NYPD precincts, and then only those individual police officers who were basically willing to come forward and swear loyalty to the Riddler would be allowed to navigate from one location to the next. But what it would do is it would lock down entire precincts, and it would make it easy to take out a multitude of different cops, right? Because if you don't have to worry about police officers running all over the place, going underground, hiding, different things like that, you can just start taking them out in huge chunks. Other precincts don't know what are happening to other precincts because all lines of communication are effectively cut off. It would make it easy to basically take control of the entire police force, or at least get rid of those who were not loyal and keep those who were loyal. This goes into Catwoman, and because Catwoman would be the one that would basically be dealing with the money, she would effectively hack into all the various accounts of the richest man in Gotham City, Bruce Wayne, and she would come to the realization that the Wayne Foundation is actually funded by offshore accounts. And the way this would work is she would basically have all those different account numbers in hand. She would drain all those assets and then redistribute them accordingly based on whatever the plan calls for. But what it would do is it would basically make her the richest woman in all of Gotham, and then in turn she would be the bank for all the various criminals that are out there, the place where they can save their money, they can put their money there, and then using those various offshore accounts, she can run that money offshore and keep it hidden away from everybody. This finally goes into the Joker, and the Joker's task was simple. The Joker would kill Batman and Robin. It's the only thing that he would do, right? It seemed to be the only thing the Joker really wanted to do. And with all of that happening, the designer essentially would allow the various criminals to take out and to really conquer the entirety of Gotham City in one fell swoop. It would happen almost overnight, right? It would happen so fast before Batman even realized what was going on. When he first began the process of investigating, they would be miles ahead of him, right? They'd be almost done with their plan by the time he first started his investigation into what was going on. Now, a lot of that was based on Batman's inexperience at the time, the fact that he wasn't that great of a superhero. I mean, he was, but in terms of his detective skills, he's learned a lot over the time that he's been operating as a superhero. And so to capitalize on that lack of experience would allow the designer's plan to come to fruition. And so ultimately Batman's response is, I'm not the man that I was, like I have evolved, I caught up to your design and I am equal to it now. And so this leads to the two of them getting into a kind of sword fight of sorts. Now, this jumps back over to Catwoman, and Catwoman coming to this realization that kind of going through and accessing these different accounts, that the Wayne Foundation is actually funded through offshore accounts. And it seems pretty shady, right? Because the way that it looks, for anybody out there, the way that it looks is there's just a whole bunch of other corporations out there or companies out there who are all basically working alongside Wayne Foundation, and they're probably looked at as like subsidiaries or something like that. But basically Bruce Wayne himself doesn't really seem to own anything. In reality, it's all money that's owned by Wayne Enterprises. But this is also beneficial because with Bruce Wayne being a person who operates as a superhero, operating as Batman, he doesn't want anybody to know how that money's being spent. And the truth is that if there was a breadcrumb, digitally or physically, in terms of actual hard cash, somebody would come looking, right? Somebody would be able to trace that breadcrumb and then ultimately draw the accurate conclusion that Bruce Wayne is Batman. And so in order to remove any possibility of him being tied to how the money's being spent with regards to things going that basically Batman would use, it's using a series of shell companies in order to hide it. And so it's kind of a funny thing because Catwoman for the most part knows all this, right? Now the underbroker, the person who's really, she's not really doing it he's not doing it of his own volition. Like she's basically told him that she was going to dump his identity if he didn't help her. But this guy has no idea that Bruce Wayne is Batman, right? In his mind, it's just this guy's probably up to some seedy stuff, and that's basically it. But regardless, the response of Catwoman is, we're going to drain all these accounts, right? Like you're going to drain all those accounts and you're going to put them in my account, right? You're basically going to put these accounts in my name and I am going to become the richest person in Gotham. Now keep in mind, Catwoman isn't doing this this in order to take revenge on Batman. She's doing this to ensure that Bruce Wayne can remain Batman and not lose all of his money, right? That's really the only reason why she's doing this at this point. Remember, her stance on the whole plan and everything all has kind of changed over the years. And so following this, what we do is we jump to probably what you guys want to see most, which is Harley Quinn versus Punchline. Now, Punchline, we don't really know much about her history, her origin, or anything like that, but the way that she fights Harley Quinn really seems to show that she's a pretty top-notch fighter. She's by no means prodigious, right? Because Harley Quinn's not the greatest fighter there ever was, right? Fighting her is not like fighting Deathstroke or somebody like that. But at the end of the day, she's, having this conversation with Punchline, talking to her, Punchline basically saying that, like, at the end of the day, Harley Quinn wanted to fix him. She wanted to make him better, right? She wanted to water him down basically into nothing. That ultimately Punchline looks at Joker for the way he is and is in love with it. And so the response of Harley Quinn is, you're a groupie. You're basically a Joker groupie. But the idea behind Punchline is that it's not really about that, right? It's not really about any kind of physical gratification that she gets from being with the Joker, if there even is any. What makes him so interesting to her is that the Joker could conquer Gotham City, and Harley Quinn could have been there for the entire ride, but she didn't want the Joker for the way he was. She wanted the Joker for the way she wanted him to be. Now, that wasn't initially how it all went down, right? Harley Quinn was initially in love with the Joker, right? That's one of the many origins of her character, but the long and short of it is that she always, in some form or fashion, was enamored by the Joker, the role he played, the way he saw the world, all that kind of stuff. And where she was kind of swept up in that, it wasn't until she began to really see what the Joker was about that she started to see that she was better off without him. And so as time began to progress, you started seeing these stories in DC Comics where Harley Quinn would leave the Joker, she'd go off and do her own thing. The Joker would basically run her out, like he would kick her out, she'd go and do her own thing, whatever the case was. She kind of began this process of separating herself from the Joker more and more often until eventually she just walked away, right? She just basically left the Joker in his entirety, and he'd just been operating solo that entire time. But it's kind of crazy because one of the funny things is that Punchline seems to be highly enamored the same way that Harley Quinn was, and she even goes as far as to say that, like, the Joker says, I'm the funniest person he knows. Well, the response of Harley, who's been around this block more than a few times, is like, yeah, but he says that to everybody, right? Like, he said that to Batman, he said it to an old nun who couldn't talk anymore. Like, he's the Joker, he jokes, like, that's what he does, right? So if you're really buying into what he's telling you as an absolute truth, then you're an idiot. Like, he's a bad guy, right? Like, he's a villain. And the response of Punchline is, maybe he is, and maybe he will hurt me one day, but I'm gonna hurt you first. She manages to get the upper hand on Harley and then slices her throat. Following that, they toss her body into the water, and then she in turn starts to go after Catwoman. It's kind of crazy to see Punchline take out Harley Quinn that way. But picking back up with Batman and the Designer again, the two of them sort of going at it and continuing to fight, so on and so forth. One of the things that Batman figures out is that the Designer had underestimated Gotham City, right? The Designer believed he could just kind of roll in here and basically start pitching these ideas to these various criminals on ways in which they could topple Batman and Robin and then take the city for themselves. But the reality is that the Designer underestimated the Joker and he underestimated Gotham City. Given this plan and the nature of what it is that he wanted to do, at the end of the day, it would only really work if Joker was willing to kill Batman and Robin. But the truth is that the Joker didn't want to. He wanted to kill everybody else, but he didn't want to kill Batman and Robin. And it scared the crap out of the Designer because the Joker couldn't be explained. He couldn't be rationalized, right? He couldn't be categorized. He wasn't somebody that was just based on a simple desire to acquire money or anything like that, right? Like it's like the Dark Knight. He just wants to watch the world burn. And that's really what the Designer didn't grasp. When the Designer first showed up here, he thought the Joker was just a petty serial killer, right? And like appeals to his vanity or to his desire to acquire wealth or to vengeance by taking out Batman and Robin would be all he really needed to be on board. But when the Joker was brought in by the Designer and the Designer learned what the Joker was really about, that he was really just a madman. He was an absolutely insane person. He didn't care about the identity of Bruce Wayne and Robin, or I'm sorry, Batman and Robin. He didn't care who they really were. He didn't care about killing them. That in fact, he wanted to keep them alive and just make them suffer by killing everybody else. The Designer realized he was beyond any real ability to be reasoned with. And so ultimately, this cost the Designer his life. And when Batman pulls off the mask, the Designer is actually dead, right? He's basically just kind of like this shambling shell, as Batman refers to it. And ultimately, he's being controlled by the Joker. And that's when Batman asked the question, what are you doing? Like, why attack me like this? What are you trying to prove? Now, Batman had figured out the Joker was controlling the Designer seemingly some time ago. There's not really an indication if that's actually true, but probably partway through this fight, he seemed to figure it out. And the response of the Joker is like, it's not my plan to break you, right? That's what comes next. Like, I have a whole year to do that, right? So, obviously teasing Joker War, but his whole idea is I needed to break her in order to break you, right? So in turn, like Batman realizes it's Catwoman that he's going after. And so immediately Deathstroke jumps in, right? Deathstroke was tasked by the Joker for completing a task. Deathstroke managed to sneak into this place, or managed to get into this place with Batman distracted. And in that moment, stabs him through the leg with a sword. And normally it wouldn't really matter. But the idea here here is that if Batman pulls it out, he's gonna bleed to death, right? So he's basically kind of stuck here at the moment, and he has to figure out what it is that he needs to do next, right? Like some kind of a medic's gonna have to be sent over here by Lucius Fox. There is no Alfred anymore, right? So it's not like Alfred can tend to his wounds or anything. So Batman's got to figure out what to do, and in that time he needs to figure out what it is that he needs to do, that allows the Joker's plan to continue going. And that's the benefit of all this, right? It's not really the grandiose nature of the plan that provides its success. It's the precious moments in between each step that provides success, right? The fact that Batman has to stop and figure out what he's going to do for like 5 or 10 minutes is all the time the Joker needs to achieve a particular goal. That's really what you're talking about here, right? As fast as the mind of Bruce Wayne works, his ability to react almost instantly, right? Whatever that case is, this means that the Joker has to be able to respond accordingly. And all this stuff seems to have been prepared for. And so switching back to Catwoman, once this is all done and Catwoman's work is finished and all this money has been transferred to essentially another external account, then the response of Catwoman is remove all my information, right? Delete all my account information, all of it has to go. And at the end of the day, the response of the underbroker is, well, I mean, your account is actually quite empty, right? Like you believe you were transferring all this information to your account, and you believe that what we were going to do now was remove your account from this database so nobody else could access it, but there's nothing sent to your account. Your account's dead because you were never sending money to your account in the first place. With that happening, there's a gunshot. We end up finding out Punchline pulled the trigger. Catwoman is essentially down for the count, and then in turn, she calls the Joker, and the Joker asks the question, is it done? And she says yes, and the Joker says, say it, I want to hear these words. And the response is, Joker, you are now worth over $100 billion. This initially picks up with Bruce Wayne in his younger years, and Bruce Wayne is more or less just kind of waiting on a guy, like just sitting at a table, doing these little designs of Gotham City. It's kind of funny because he basically says they were never really a design for the city. The dark designs were always for him, right? But he ultimately ends up basically, tracking this guy down, finding him, and then basically following him. And he basically tells him, look, like I followed your clues. I know you're in there. Like I know who you are. I need to talk to you. And ultimately, Bruce Wayne kind of makes his way in, and this guy basically says, or at least Bruce reveals, this guy's name is Cassander Wycliffe Baker. Now, for those of you guys who were following our story, or at least following the Dark Designs, this guy was the nemesis of the designer, right? The guy that the designer basically spent all this time trying to track down, or at least trying to defeat, spent years and years and years in a room creating a plan, so that by the time this guy Baker figured out what was going on, the plan was already almost done, right? And Baker's days were essentially finished. The other funny thing about this too is that Baker basically, indicates he knows who Bruce Wayne is, right? He knows exactly who he is, which isn't really the biggest thing in the world, right? It's like from Batman Begins that like Bruce Wayne he'd have to travel 2,000 miles to find somebody who didn't know his name. But the way that James Tynion really kind of hits on this to really show how good of a detective this guy is he says, like, I can tell from the cut of your jacket which port of Japan you traveled here from, right? I can tell you where you learned the art of the katana, right? I can tell you where you were when you learned how to slow your heartbeat. I know all these things about you, right? The cut of your hair tells me where you learned how to fly. The calluses on your hand tell me where you learned to forge metal. Like, I know all these things about you. I know everything about you just by looking at you. That's how good this detective was, right? That's how good Baker was. You could take one glimpse at Bruce Wayne and then say, I know everywhere you've been within the last, however long. And when Bruce asks, how could you possibly know? Baker kind of reveals this secret room where he has like all these pictures all over the place, right? And it's kind of like this is everything I know about this place, right? Everything I know about you, everything I know about everything. I've seen all kinds of stuff. And he says, I'm going to teach you the most important lesson. I'm not going to teach you how to be a detective. I'm going to teach you how to lose. And that's a super important thing here. And on the surface, it's easy for you to kind of be like, okay, that's weird, right? And to kind of write it off. No, it's not necessarily important to win. It's important to know how to lose, because if you know how to lose, you know how to understand why you lost, you know how to correct the reason you lost, and then you know how to win. Because the reality of this is you don't win 100% of the time, right? It's like that line from Ocean's 11, right? Like, because the house always takes you, right? No matter how long you play, if you play long enough, the house wins. Unless when that perfect hand comes along, you bet big and then you take the house. That's basically what this is, right? It's Batman being taught at a very young age, you're going to lose. It's going to happen, right? It's inevitable. But what you have to learn is how to recover from that loss and how to go forward accordingly. And so what we end up doing is picking up in the immediate aftermath of the last video that we covered, right? The last comic where basically Batman was stabbed through the leg by Deathstroke. Now, a lot of people kind of looked at it as though it was some kind of a joke, right? Like Batman stabbed through the leg. What's the case? It's not just a random leg stabbing, right? Like Deathstroke hit an artery. Now, technically basically, if he really wanted to kill Batman in 30 seconds, he would have stabbed him in that artery right down there in the groin, right? He'll bleed out like that, right? It'll take no time at all. But he stabbed him in a location where it's like one of these things, if you pull it out, you're gonna bleed to death. And that's why Lucius Fox was basically contacted to get in here, because it bought Deathstroke time, right? It bought Deathstroke the time he needed to basically leave, right? So Lucius Fox has to get here. Batman's not gonna go anywhere. He's not gonna go running out, because any major movement he makes takes the risk of you know, exacerbating this stab or this injury with this sword. So he's gonna have to just wait until Lucius gets there. Then Lucius is gonna do whatever he has to do. He's not a medic, right? He's not Alfred. He's not a trained doctor, right? So he's gonna do whatever he can. And then there's a time for Batman to recover, however long it takes for him to recover. That buys Deathstroke a breadth of time. And when you're talking about a scenario like this, all Deathstroke really needs is like half an hour to 45 minutes. And he's on the other, he's on a plane, gone out of Gotham City, and who knows where he's at. And this is also singularly more important, because while Batman wouldn't normally have the resources to track Deathstroke down if he wanted to, remember, all those resources are gone now, right? So you end up having basically Lucius Fox, who kind of just throws like a compression bandage, more or less, onto Batman, which does enough to kind of keep him from bleeding out all over the place. You know, it's more or less just kind of like taking your hand and covering over the wound and putting pressure on it. That's all it really does. It's a stopgap measure, right? The response is like, Bruce, you have to go to a hospital and get some kind of surgery done or something like that, because if you don't, you're just gonna bleed out. And so what Lucius does is immediately start dropping all this information, right? Like Batman tells Lucius, like, they have the fortune now, right? Joker has all my account numbers, all that information. He's got everything about me. And the response of Lucius is, yeah, I know. Lawyers have already seized your house. Like, you're wanted for embezzling millions of dollars, which we know Bruce Wayne was doing, or at least that seemed to be the case, that like Bruce was funneling money, or he was embezzling money out of the company into foreign accounts, and Wayne Enterprises itself was doing that, running through foreign banks. Bruce Wayne's wanted for all of that, right? So he's wanted by the law, his fortune's gone, he has nothing, right? It's just like, there's really nothing he can do. And the response of Lucius Fox is, I would love to be in your corner the way that Alfred was. I'd love to be the guy who would be here and help you every step of the way. But if I'm gonna fight this off, I have to operate as the CEO of Wayne Enterprises. I can only keep them at bay for so long. So I can't be in your corner. I have to go take care of this, right? And it's one of these things where he says, if I was Alfred, sure, I'd be able to do that, right? Because Alfred was a Swiss Army knife. Alfred did everything, but I'm not Alfred Pennyworth. I'm Lucius Fox, and all I can do is the best that I can do. And so in turn, you have Batman who asks, where's Selina Kyle, right? You think he would have asked that already because it's the woman he's gonna marry, but he's like, where's Selina Kyle? And the response to Lucius is, she was shot, she's in a hospital, and then he's just like, I want to talk to her right now. Where Lucius is a little hesitant about that, focusing more on the health of Batman that he's getting ready to pass out. You know, Batman's like, I don't want to hear any of it. I want to talk to Selina Kyle. And this basically leads to Lucius kind of putting his daughter on the phone, who puts Selina on the phone, and Selina's kind of in and out of consciousness, right? She's barely making it. She's just slightly unconscious. And it's one of these things where Batman kind of hits at where he feels like he fell short, right? Where he feels like he kind of screwed up. It's one of the great things Tynion's focused on here, and it's one of the elements that's fallen under the radar, right? There was this really good moment when Batman confronted Deathstroke, and they were kind of going back and forth in this argument, and Deathstroke was like, you were the one who like you stepped it up first, right? Like, you were the one that made things worse first. We were criminals who were doing things. You stepped it up against us, right? Like, you exacerbated the situation. And Batman's response was, yes, I know. And that's really kind of how Bruce Wayne was, right? That Bruce Wayne was a kid whose parents were shot in front of him, and he's been crying about it his whole life. And he ended up going through all these different training sessions, learning all these different things. And when he came back to Gotham City, he didn't meet with an equal force. He met with overwhelming force, right? He hammered him. It's like, what was it? The Dark Knight, the Dark Knight film. He hammered and hammered and hammered all these different guys to the point of desperation. He's the one that made things worse. That instead of responding to them with an adequate force, he responded with more than what he needed. And that's what made things worse in Gotham City. It was Batman's actions that pushed people further and further. And it's what made things more and more extreme. Not only that, he, because of the life he lived, because of the person that he was, he systematically pushed away everybody that cared about him, right? Everybody that mattered to him, he pushed every single one of them away. And it led him to where he is right now. This was not the life Selina Kyle was banking on. Selina Kyle joined up with Batman because she was expecting a better life. She was expecting things to improve, but Batman made them worse. And so the result of this is that he basically says, like, I'm going to go and I'm going to try to clean this up, and I'm going to try to make sure everything's sorted out. Hopefully you can forgive me, and hopefully you'll be here when I get back. But he's like, I'll kind of be waiting on you. And in his anger and in his rampage, of course, he smashes a window. But Lucius Fox is kind of shocked to hear that Batman's actually going to go out, right? He's got a stab in his leg where he's just bleeding out, but he's going to go out there and continue to fight anyway. It's one of these things where Batman's making a stupid choice. He's making a stupid decision that he seems to kind of be overcome with emotion. But the reality of this is when he kind of chimes in and he says, Lucius, it's not just vengeance here. It's not me just pissed off because my money was taken and I'm really mad. He's like, there's a bigger picture at play here. The Joker has all my resources. He has everything that Batman had. He's got all the Batmobiles. He's got everything in Wayne Manor. He's got all the money. He's got all the technology. Everything that I use in order to function as Batman is now in possession of the Joker. So here's what you're gonna do. You're gonna call up Leslie Tompkins, who most of you guys know is the one that basically, she's kind of like the night nurse from Marvel Comics, right? She's the one that basically runs a free clinic where she tends to the injuries of various heroes, some villains, depending on what the situation is. And then he basically says, like, what you are about to see in the city of Gotham is gonna be an attack from the Joker. And it's gonna be like nothing we've ever seen before, right? Because this is not the Joker flooding the city with Joker toxin like he did during Endgame. It's nothing like that. This is Joker on a whole new level. It's the Joker with advanced technology and with insanity. Who in the hell knows what he's going to do, right? And so you kind of switch over to Deathstroke for a moment, and this is kind of a quick throwaway thing, and it's easy to ignore, but it's massively significant because you've got Deathstroke talking to Lady Shiva, or I guess Cheshire is really what her name is, but you know, she's kind of like, nobody here is, they're all kind of pissed off that they were used, and Deathstroke's like, I don't really care, you know, they were getting paid well for it. And when she asks, like, what are you doing? He just says, like, 9 million people. And she's like, what? And he's like, I'm just taking one last look. And like literally looking at this city of 9 million people, which is about to devolve into absolute chaos and pandemonium. Switch over to Batman, who goes to get Catwoman because he knows Joker's going to start coming after everybody. When he gets there, she's gone. He has no idea where Catwoman's gone to. She's just vanished. Now, initially the implication was the Joker's henchmen showed up and snatched her up. No, the Joker's henchmen are there and they're like, it was a smart move getting rid of Catwoman. So they don't know where Catwoman is. And where they kind of make this offhanded remark of, you know, I doubt the boss would care if we had some crossfire, some casualties. And they ask him, and Joker's on the phone and he's like, no, I really wouldn't mind. I'm in such a good mood. Go ahead and take out a whole floor if you want to, right? And where Batman asks the Joker, do you have Catwoman? He says, no. She bailed the second that she was stitched up, right? She saw this coming, man. I don't know why you didn't, but she saw this coming. Right? Like maybe she knows your real bae's back in town. Who knows? But whatever the reason is, she's out of here, right? Like she basically ended up taking off. And that's when the Joker starts to taunt Batman. He's like, oh, you're bleeding out. You got to go and get yourself stitched up, man, because with the war that I'm going to bring you, I want you at 100% because I want you to know that when you lost to me, you didn't lose because of some technicality. You didn't lose because you weren't functioning at full capacity. I want you to know you lost to me when you were at your best, right? I have your money. I have your house. I have your company. The Joker's like an ex-wife, right? Like I have your house, your car, your company. I have the kids. I have it all. I have the dog. Hell, I even took the goldfish. Like it's nuts, right? The Joker's like, I have everything of yours, man. I have everything that belongs to you. I'm going to take all these toys that you've been building in Wayne Enterprises. I'm going to take all these things and I'm going to use them, right? Like for years and years and years, you've been fighting me and I've been using the resources of an abandoned toy factory. Well, guess what? That's not the case anymore, man. You're totally alone. You have none of your resources. You have none of your money. You have nothing at your side. You've got no family. You've got no girlfriend. You've got no butler. You are absolutely and totally categorically alone. It doesn't look very good for you. That's what's so crazy because the Joker's like, I've got designs for this city, man. I've got designs for everything. I'm going to tear this city from the ground up and I'm going to rebuild it all. And you're going to be the one that pays for it all. And he says, so let's get this started. He says, boys, fire. They open city on Batman, just start spraying down. Batman jumps out of a window. You immediately switch to Catwoman, right? She wakes up kind of seemingly out of the middle of nowhere. And we find out she was rescued by the Penguin. That the Penguin's like, man, this is a pretty wild situation. Like it's initially, you know, she kind of says, well, you know, when he asks about the designer, she says the designer's dead, right? Joker's been playing us this entire time. And the Penguin's like, okay, so like I can let you into the private lounge. This private lounge is called the Cool Room, right? This whole place basically houses, and it's actually so cool to see the Mad Hatter again. I haven't seen him in a while, but it houses basically almost all of Batman's villains, right? And the response to the Joker is like, this place is basically a safe house, that when things pop off, this is where we go. Like when things are bad enough, the whole city's in jeopardy, this is where we basically kind of hang out at until things get terrible. I don't see Kite Man, which really kind of sucks, right? I'd love to see Kite Man. Hell yeah. But nonetheless, you know, when Catwoman says like, I need to get out of here, the response of the Penguin is that's not possible. This entire place is in lockdown, right? It's a Joker attack, which is kind of wild, right? To hear that like when the Joker decides to attack Gotham City, this is how all the villains react, right? There's no like holding the Joker off. It's like, okay guys, let's all go into lockdown. Let's go underground. You know, the Penguin says hundreds of people, probably even thousands are going to die. We're sitting this one out, right? So like buckle in, Catwoman. It's going to be a long, bloody summer. It's nuts. And so you end up switching back over to Batman, who's just kind of musing to himself, right? Talking about everything that he had learned from Alfred, how Alfred always wanted him to strive for better, how Alfred looked at Bruce Wayne, who was kind of governed by this notion of vengeance, and was kind of like, you have to become better. And Bruce Wayne finally kind of buys into it and says, yes, you know, with the entire city, with me being the only thing that I have left, yes, I ask you for a signal. What do I do? And he kind of gets one in the form of like an electric storm, and he says, I will become a better Batman, right? Now, we don't know what this means. That's what makes it so cool. We don't know if Bruce is like, yes, I'm going to become a better Batman. I'm going to be more ruthless. I'm going to be more cruel. I'm going to be like I was after Jason Todd died, basically, until like Tim Drake showed up into my life and became the new Robin. Or if he's like, I'm going to be a more honorable Batman, right? I'm going to make up for the failings that I had when I initially became the guy that I became. Is he going to be a Batman who works alongside all the other villains to take out the Joker? We have no idea. We got to wait till the next issue. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like. Now I'll catch you all later. Peace.